Hey, welcome back to Sustainable Voice. Leigh, good to see you again. How are you?
I'm great, thank you. I'm happy to see you as well.
We're talking about the color blue. Blue is my power color. So I'm going to tell our branding guys that we're changing everything about this podcast to blue now. We're no
Yeah.
longer green, we're going to be blue.
Well, blue is a really good color. It's calming. It also is supposed to signify trust and reliability and all of that. And why not be a power color? But green, green is one of my favorite colors, not because of money, but I like green, but that is what we're talking about today, right?
We're talking about fiscal policy in poor countries. And you know what? Both colors apply. We're going to talk about green until I'm blue in the face. So how's
Perfect.
that? Perfect.
Perfect.
You are totally out of your element here, and I am absolutely in my playground right now.
Yeah, I know nothing. I was telling you before we started recording that I'm just along for the ride today, so we'll see where this goes.
Well, so to all my listeners and to all our listeners, I would say this. If the thought of fiscal policy bores you to death, awesome. It bores me as well. And if you look at some of the policy decisions made by our politicians around the world, it clearly bores them too.
Mhm.
The difference is that we actually still care what's being done, whereas I don't know that all of them actually know what to do.
Yeah,
Um,
I was wondering if they're bored or they just don't know.
I think it's a
They're
combination of
ignorant.
both. What's the phrase from The Simpsons? A little from column A, a little from column B.
Yeah.
So, so those that don't know, I do have a background in finance and economics. My study was on international economics. My first career was in finance as an analyst, as well as a trader. And I worked for a Fortune 500 firm, and I got very little joy out of it. There was just nothing fulfilling about it. Nothing wrong with the company, just nothing fulfilling. Some people just really like money, and okay, great. I like what money has the power to do for others.
Mhm.
And that's where it draws me into it. It's not, yes, everybody needs money and wants money to live comfortably and whatnot. I like what money does to others in terms of how it helps them. I don't mean what it does when they get it. I mean how it can be used as a force of good.
Mhm.
And we talked about that last episode about water, and the same thing we talked about last episode applies here, where everybody is eager to point out the problem, but nobody wants to actually point out the solution.
Mhm.
The difference is this. When it comes to fiscal matters, if you go to any policymaker or economist around the world and you ask 10 of them, you will get 10 different answers every single time. And it's not that they don't know, it's that literally there are 10 different ways to answer this. So I guarantee you, to all of our listeners, I guarantee you, some of you are going to listen to what I have to say and go, God, he's an idiot.
Mm.
And some are going to listen and say, wow, it makes sense. So let's start with this bold statement. The poorest countries in the world got the pandemic right. And I know you're probably gonna look at me saying, "What are you talking
I
about?"
I am. I want to hear more, so I know you'll tell me more, but
I will. I will.
that caused me to just pause for a minute.
So I will tell you. I'll work backwards. I will tell you. When I see some countries like Kenya, my home country, and I see countries like this struggling with inflation, struggling with debt, struggling with stuff that are direct root causes of the pandemic, economic root causes of the pandemic. I actually did this. I wrote a message to Dr. Tedros of the World Health Organization, and I wrote a message to him, wrote a letter to him. I'm sure it wasn't read, and I just simply said, "This is all your fault." That's all I said. This is all your fault.
Wow.
I'm not talking about health policy. That's a
Yeah.
separate issue altogether. But I am talking about that statement because, and I'll work backwards, because we entered the pandemic in April of 2020, end of March.
Mhm.
In September, I watched him is sitting next to the head of the World Bank, telling the world that they were working on a plan for fragile economies with the World Bank. And I was screaming at the TV saying, "You're too late.
Okay. Yeah.
What's the point? You're too late." Right? I am not talking about whether or not the pandemic was is real or not, or vaccine, no vaccine. This is not a debate about that, right? I'm not talking about that. I am talking about the fact that we made economic decisions without forgetting the age-old, tried and true dilemma that faces every poor country in the world, which is that whenever something economic occurs, those countries are forced to choose between health and economics. Every time. That formula has never changed. The only difference in the pandemic is we had to make the same choice, right? Go back to the rhetoric in the very beginning, and it was, oh, well, we'll do this, and we're gonna, the pandemic will be gone, and COVID will be gone. It's not gone. It's here to stay, right? I am not talking about health policy. I'm not talking about the amazing work that our scientists did to create vaccines and to keep us safe. I'm not talking about those. They have my respect. I am not talking about that. I am talking to people at the World Bank. I am talking to people at the World Health Organization, people at the IMF, people at different loaning bodies to say, shame on you, because you didn't see this coming a mile away. Before the pandemic, before any of this happened, the same thing occurred. We got a trial run of it during Ebola in 2014 when all of Africa shut down tourism-wise, and what those countries had to do. We got a taste of it after the terrorist attacks in 9/11 when tourism shut down in these countries. We got a taste of it. We get a taste every time there's a global conflict that occurs in places. We get a taste of it in Latin America when these protests were coming up all over Chile and all over different places, and the impact it had on tourism. We got a taste of it in Peru again. 2 years ago when the political dilemmas were occurring and the impact it had on it. These countries don't have the ability to simply print money the way the first world does. And it's a core periphery system. And anybody with a basic degree in economics will understand this. And the only reason I put that note to Dr. Tedros, I know he's not an economist. He's a brilliant, brilliant medical mind. I am not questioning that. The only reason that I'm saying this is all his fault is because he started making economic impact and economic decisions without understanding the ramifications of what was going to happen, without forgetting that core principle, which is that the richest countries in the world had the luxury of recovering, of dealing with it. The poorest countries were left to fight over the scraps. And I'll give you a prime example of what I mean, okay?
Yeah.
Let's look at Sri Lanka. Let's look at what happened. They were not getting the funding they needed. And what they were getting from the IMF, they then went to countries like China and got money from them as well. They then owed everybody money, and austerity measures had to be put into place. Now, I'm generalizing, I understand. There's a whole separate episode on what went down and why that occurred. That country did not have the luxury of simply printing money. They had to borrow money at unreasonable rates without any hope of forgiveness, whereas a country like Argentina was forgiven 9 times in 6 years for their debt, right? So there's no consistent approach to how the forgiveness is done. Then on top of that, they were propping up their currency or it was collapsing, and they had no way around it simply because of the fact that they had borrowed so much money simply to make it through something that wasn't their making. Right? They were not left to choose, right? And you go through the pandemic, look at the countries like Kenya, like Ecuador, like South Africa, countries that started opening their borders and they were publicly shamed for opening their borders. Look at South Africa, when they were the ones who found the Omicron virus and said there is a variation of the virus, here it is, and they were publicly shamed and their borders closed, to the point where a lot of the medical community in South Africa came out and said, you're impacting us negatively for telling the truth. You asked us to be open. And as a result, you're whipping us publicly. You know what? We're done sharing. There was no, how do we as a global, and I say this as a global because for decades, for as long as I can remember being in university, 20 years plus, we have always been called a global community, a global economy. Global economies work in one voice. This was 100 voices all saying 100 different things. And not one person to actually bring them together. And that was Dr. Tedros' job. That was the job of the World Health Organization. That was the job of the World Bank. That was the job of the IMF. And now you look in Latin America and you have these elections where the people they're going to are on the extreme side, opposite side of the spectrum in terms of who they're electing, right? People promising free money. And it doesn't come through, right? You look at what happened in Peru in 2022 in terms of how they impeached the one president, and then Dina Boluarte came in as president, right? What's a shame there is that what got lost is the fact that Peru had its first female president. That got lost because it was buried under the fact that that the previous president was impeached for promising free money and then corruption set in, something that the country was forced to go towards because they had no money, because they were in dire straits, because of how hard the pandemic was on them, right? So that's where the conversation about fiscal policy has to start. You start playing that forward and you start looking at debt levels among these countries. If we as the US are at the highest levels of debt we have ever been, even before World War II, so which means that we are at, I think it's 120% of GDP. We are spending 20 cents more on everything than we're bringing in. We are losing 20 cents on every single dollar. And the only reason that it's moving forward is because the debt hasn't been called. What happens when the debt gets called?
And who are our underwriters? Who do we owe?
Among them, China.
Yeah.
Among them, Japan. Among others. In the 80s, Japan was the highest holder, or the largest holder of treasuries, US treasuries. There's not them anymore.
So
go ahead.
No, go ahead, finish your thought.
Well, I was going to say, and I'm not villainizing China here. So anybody who's listening, if you think I'm villainizing a particular country, if any of our listeners think I'm villainizing a country or villainizing the World Organization, you're missing the point. You should probably change the podcast right now. You probably shouldn't listen anymore, because you may not like what comes out of my mouth next. But anybody who's listening, this is important. Anybody who understands what we're saying. You know my story, Leigh. You know that I was born and raised in Kenya. You know my wife's family is from Sudan, from Uganda. My mother's family is from Sudan. We have seen all these things and how they transpired. And we have put some of the smartest minds in the world in charge of some of the biggest decisions. And I say shame on them, because their expectations should be as high as their intellect.
Yeah.
Right? I'm not talking about elections. That's part of it. I'm talking about people who are appointed because of their mind, because they're the brightest minds. How did you not see this coming a mile away?
Yeah.
We know the pandemic was a once in a lifetime, once in a generation event. We understand that, but the economic fallout of it is something we've had experience with for decades. It's not new. First thing you learn in Econ 101 is guns or butter, right?
Right.
Guns or butter. And
Yeah.
what are you going to produce? Food or weapons? What are you going to do? And anybody who has anybody who wants to be brutally honest will tell you, if you want to fix an economy, start a small war.
Yeah.
Right? Make it quick. That's the basics. Well, when you have a pandemic, how do you start dealing with that? Right now, we've talked about this over the years, and we've talked about, since this podcast has started, we've talked about the impact that the pandemic has had. But we have to go forward, because now the fallout is starting to occur, and we haven't even paid the price for all the money that the world printed during that time. That hasn't even happened yet. But we're talking about the poorest countries in the world paying the price for something that wasn't their fault.
Yeah. So, as you're telling me this, I can break this down for me, into a context I can understand. When you're telling me this, I remember during the pandemic, I mean, I felt like we were every man for himself, for just even on a local level, like even within my neighborhood, every man for himself. And then, in my neighborhood, I remember we kind of came together as a neighborhood to support each other and all of that. But thinking about this on a global level with all these different countries, poorer countries, who definitely, I mean, I feel like we all compartmentalize, for the most part, all countries in the world, every man for himself. So so I guess what I'm asking is, why should I care? Like, why should I care?
Right.
What happened in Sri Lanka? How does it affect me? Like, how does it truly affect me? Because we became all survivalists in that moment.
Right.
And how do we get out of that?
That's a great question. And this is the part I'm going to simplify it. Okay. So I'm going to simplify this. So I'm not going to go into pure detail, but let's just play this in the simplest and the easiest denominator, because it's important for all of our listeners to understand, because I guarantee they've got the same question you have. Sri Lanka had money borrowed from the IMF. The IMF called back their debt. They borrowed money from China to pay back the IMF. Now they couldn't pay back either. Now you just mentioned who is our biggest debt holder, right? Who is the biggest holder? We just talked about who that country is, right? And they own the debt for a lot of countries. They have economically colonized Africa as a continent. They have economically colonized other parts of Asia, right? Like Sri Lanka. If that debt is not repaid, and we all see what's happening in China's economy right now with the real estate market, in terms of just the collapse of the entire residential real estate market in China, and you see that they're going through some pretty painful moments. Yes, they're a powerful economy. I'm not saying they're not going to remain a powerful economy, but they are running into some tough times. Whether the media there wants to admit it or not, whether we want to admit it or not, 1 + 1 still equals 2. The day it equals 3 is the day we all get in trouble. And that's what's happening there. So if Sri Lanka can't pay their debt, if Argentina, which, by the way, up until recently, when the new president came in, was accepting renminbi as currency in Argentina because of a dollar shortage, right? So with Argentina, Sri Lanka, Kenya, Tanzania, South Africa, Egypt, name it. If they don't pay back their debt, where does China come calling to get their interest payments? Who had the only country that can afford? Exactly. That's when it affects you.
Give me my money.
Right. So I'll show you what happened in Kenya. Kenya had to start paying back because they were in default with Exim Bank, which is the US lender. They were in default with China. They had to pay back. The only way that they could pay back is by increasing taxation by 40% among their citizens. A country that is still reeling with unemployment near 30%. And you are taxing the poor who have no money 40% and forcing those people in Kenya, for example, go down to 1 meal a day instead of 3, so they could pay their taxes, because they understand that without paying their taxes, they're going to be in deep trouble when it comes to any kind of lending from other countries, when it comes to, just internet relations. What's the phrase from any mob movie you've seen? These are not the type of people you default on. Right? These are not the type of people you piss off.
Yeah.
So imagine us, you, me, anybody else. You have kids, I have kids. We have worked our whole life to be able to provide for these kids. My late father worked his whole life to provide for me. Imagine you, me, my late father, my mother being taxed 40% more simply because we don't have the money to pay back the debt, and we don't.
Yeah.
What happens then? Right? What happens then? You are seeing a paradigm shift in the world. So that's how it impacts us, right? And the problem is, let's take Kenya, right? Kenya has issued euro bonds to be able to prop up their currency. Oh, look, the currency's gotten stronger because the currency was a year and a half ago, was it 100 shillings a dollar, or even 2 years ago, 100 shillings to a dollar. It's down near 150 right now, 130 came up to. So we're celebrating, oh, look, it's getting stronger, near 130, near 130. Here's where it is. 2 problems with that. In order to get the currency to be more powerful, you have had to issue more debt. You have had to issue euro bonds, which were bought up right away, which is a good thing, which means the people who bought your debt believe in your economy, believe in your potential in the future, right? You are a country that actually has the ability to have a bright light going forward. So there's that part of it there. However, that debt payment is coming due. And that currency is going to sink back down again. And that taxation of 40% increase has not gone anywhere. It's still there. That's just one. Take Argentina. Yes, what you see in the news, the fact that the president of Argentina, President Milei, who has a PhD in economics, who does understand economics, for as strange as he is, put his policies aside for a second, he does understand economics.
Yeah.
But what is he dealing with, right? He has basically come in and said he is moving towards what seems to be a dollar-denominated economy, which means he's going to use the US dollar as his main currency. Go back a year before he was elected, and you've got US dollar shortages in Argentina because a black market had formed for the currency. What that basically means is Argentina is telling the world that their currency is worth 300 pesos to a dollar. but the local people, because of inflation, which was up near 300%, is actually showing it valued at 800 pesos to a dollar. So instead of putting the money in the bank, they're hiding the money under their mattress and then trading it amongst themselves at 800 pesos to a dollar. A black market formed. And the first thing he did was devalue the peso to 800 pesos to a dollar. Every poor country in the world is going to have to do what he did, which is at some point, if you go up and say, like Kenya comes up and says, look, we're at 130 shillings to a dollar. If the people who are living in your country look at that, and the way they're behaving is if your currency is at 150 shillings to a dollar, which means that they see the cost of things being at 300% higher, 400% higher, whereas you're telling the world it's 100% higher, for example, right? They are not going to put the money in the bank. They are going to use the money and trade amongst themselves and basically have it under their mattress.
So it's not in circulation.
Not in circulation. And then you're going to get, and just anybody who's listening, go and Google Argentina dollar shortage. You'll see it all over the news. It's going to happen in other countries. It's happening in Egypt right now. It's happening in other countries as well, where all of a sudden a black market forms because what the government perceives their inflation to be is not what it really is. And so a black market forms, and the only thing left for the government to do when they have no choice, because they literally have a proverbial gun to their head, is they have to devalue their currency. And that's what Kenya is going to be forced to do, whether they want to do it or not, right? They're celebrating, and the president is talking about, yes, we're 130 shares to a dollar. We're going to get stronger. The currency is going to get stronger. Till what point? It is temporary. It will sink back down to 150 shillings to a dollar. And then it's like reality sets in. It's like watching a bad movie again and again and again. Right?
Yeah. So a few minutes ago, you said a few countries got it right. So who got it right? Did anybody come out of this unscathed?
No, everybody. No. When I say got it right, what I mean by that is that they figured out that they're going to have to choose economics.
Oh.
They figured out. Ecuador opened their borders in June of 2020.
Yeah.
Here's what they saw. I was on a call with the Minister of Tourism at the time in March or April 2020, and we were tracking unemployment. And I track unemployment in several countries. Ecuador is one of them. In March of 2020, unemployment in Ecuador was 12.5%. By June, it was over 60%.
6-0?
6-0. So that's why I was infuriated when I heard the World Bank in September say, we're going to create a package for fragile economies. It's too damn late. What's the point now? You might as well light a match and just go blow it all up. Because, I mean, it's like basically wrecking your car and saying, wait, I'm going to build you a body shop to fix the car. The driver's already in the hospital. What's the point? Instead of making the road safer, you're looking backwards. That was where I was disappointed. I was beyond disappointed. I was angry. I was furious. Because I am not claiming to be the smartest person in the world. They are.
Yeah.
And so if me, who has a medium IQ, was able to figure that out pretty quickly, how come they couldn't?
Yeah.
Right? That's the part that got to me. And that's why I wrote the message to the World Health Organization and said, this is all your fault. Now, people are going to hear this and say, yeah, you know what? This whole vaccine is a hoax and this and that. I am not talking about that. If you think that's what I'm saying, you have missed the point completely. Right? When we talk about you and I have talked about this, right? When we talk about elections in our country or any country, and when Sarah Palin was running as a running mate with John McCain against President Obama and Joe Biden, right at the time. This is in the first election, and I kept hearing from people, "Oh, she's just like one of us." God, I hope not. I hope she's smarter than us. No, not like us. Oh, she's one of us. No.
Yeah.
No, she needs to be smarter. And I'm not, she, whoever needs to be smarter. And this is so important because when you talk about countries, Ecuador got it right. They figured out we're opening our border. Tanzania got it right. They're also opening our borders. They chose economics over health, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. And I'll tell you what I mean by this, okay? Tanzania got roasted in the news. And I'm sure people will listen to this and say, well, John Magufuli was the president of Tanzania. He thought the pandemic was not real. It was a hoax. COVID wasn't a real thing. And drink hot tea with lemon and whatnot. And that. Let me tell you something, brother. I was in Tanzania in March of 2020. February, January. Yeah, right around there, 2021. I was there. And I was there right when right when he passed away. It was March 2021.
Mhm.
I was there when he passed away. I was there in Tanzania when he passed away. He was in Kenya. I don't care what somebody in Tanzania tells us. He was in Kenya. Separate topic, but I know for a fact he was getting treatment in Nairobi, because when his counsel came out and said, "Oh well, he passed away from heart disease," and he was in Dar es Salaam. No, he wasn't, because there aren't any heart machines, MRI machines, EKGs in Tanzania. They're all in Nairobi. So I right away we knew, but that's a separate topic.
Yeah.
His replacement, the current president of Tanzania, she is amazing.
Mm.
I'm not talking about her policies. Policies are polarizing like any politician. She makes some bad decisions, some good decisions. Put that aside. I got to meet her in Rwanda last year.
Mm.
And I was there when I heard her inauguration, when she came in, and the way she spoke, she understood the value of tourism. She also understood the value of being part of the international community. And so she had brought the country back into the international community to accept vaccines. And case in point, right? She brought the country back to the international community because she was told, look, your predecessor removed your country from the international community when it came to vaccines and whatnot. So what are you going to do? Yes, World Organization, we're back. Give us the vaccines, whatnot, this and that. You know what they got? They got 500,000 doses of Johnson & Johnson vaccine from the US, and that was doses we didn't want.
Mm-hmm.
That's it. Nobody else gave them anything. That was it. All the talk about the World Health Organization sending them vaccines and helping fragile economies, nothing happened.
That sounds like when people donate expired food to the food bank.
That's exactly right. And I know this because on the tourism side, we were getting our people on the front line to get these vaccines, and they made us show us proof you have travelers coming into the country. Only then will you get your vaccine first.
Wow.
That's what they made us say.
Wow.
Can you think about that? So
That's
literally fighting over the scraps.
Yeah.
So
what should they have done? What should the WHO have done?
Okay.
In the rear view?
In the rear view, they had a program in place in India with the Serum Institute to mass produce vaccines.
Mm-hmm.
Mass produced AstraZeneca, mass produced Pfizer, mass produced. It was basically part of something called I think it was called COVAX, I think it was COVAX is the name of it. But it was a plan to provide vaccines to the poor countries. Less than 10% got to where we're supposed to going. That plan should have worked. They had the right idea because the Serum Institute in India had the ability to manufacture all these vaccines. Here's the problem: countries like Canada, which had the ability to buy the vaccines or even produce them, they would import them. They got a shipment of over 1 million doses, 1.6 million to be exact, from that same collection that was meant to go somewhere else. Why was that allowed? And before somebody says, well, you're hating on Canada, my wife is from Canada. My in-laws live in Canada. So I'm not hating on Canada. I'm not blaming Canada. Again, I told Dr. Tedros, I messaged, he probably hasn't read it, and I'm sure he hasn't. This is your fault, because the policing wasn't in place. You mentioned earlier about one voice, right? We're a global community and it's every man for themselves. That's the first thing they should have gotten different. Right? When we as a company or as a society, think about your neighborhood, think about your if you work in an office, think about your corporation, think about this. There is usually one voice, and in times of crisis, there is always one voice. Whether you want there to be one or not, one voice rises to the surface, right? Organically. Mm-hmm. Where was that voice? During World War II, it was Winston Churchill, it was FDR. One voice for the world to say, this is what we stand for. After 9/11, it was George W. Bush. One voice. Let me ask you a question. In 2002, where were you?
Well, I was just figuring out how to be a new mom, I think. I was actually, yeah.
Were you in the Coast Guard at that point?
No. I was living in Washington and working for the cruise line as a sales type person at that point. Yeah.
When the terrorist attacks happened on 9/11 on September 12th and on the days afterwards, did you have any confusion as to who was in charge?
You know what? I don't know if I'm the right person to ask that because my Isabel was like 2 weeks old at that
Oh, so you were
point, and
focused
all
there.
I was doing was feeding my baby and sitting in bed and going, "My God, what has just happened, and how am I going to raise my child in this?" Uh, I do remember being very confused and not understanding things. Yeah.
But if somebody came to you and started asking you to make decisions about your child, started making them for you, would you let them, or would you
Oh,
be,
no, no,
you'd
no.
be firmly in charge, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Even today, if somebody came to you and started making decisions about your daughters, who are amazing, amazing people, that you've raised them to be such amazing, successful people, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
Would you let them, or do your daughters have a clear understanding of who's in charge?
They have a clear understanding of who's in
Okay.
charge. Yeah.
So if your daughters have a clear understanding that you're in charge,
Hmm.
and I can tell you because I was working in finance during that time, and I was sitting at my desk at that office in Arizona when that attack happened, and subsequently, I'm not talking about political parties.
Yeah.
But if you just simply look at George W. Bush's approval rating, on those days afterwards, it was the highest approval rating of any president since World War II,
Yeah. Yeah. I do remember that
right?
now that you mentioned.
Everybody knew who was in charge.
Hmm.
Everybody knew who was in charge. And that was a crisis point, an inflection point for us as a country,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
Everybody knew who was in charge. You start going into the economic collapse in 08, 09. You start thinking about this. The Fed chairman was coming out and talking. You knew right away who was understanding of
Yeah.
what was happening. You knew who was in charge. You think about just in general, you have all these experiences. But then when the pandemic occurred, the people who should have been in charge made the proclamation that it's a pandemic,
Yeah.
made the proclamation, and then went away.
They
And they
did.
would, and then they would show up to say, it's here, it's going to get worse.
Yeah.
I kept thinking and this is one of my favorite books to read. Everybody, and I'm going to nerd out right now. Plato had a book called The Republic. We read it in college.
Hmm.
It is my favorite book still.
Mm.
That scene in the cave where everybody's looking at the wall and there's somebody describing to those people about what the fire looks like. Don't turn around. Don't look at the fire. Let me tell you what it's like. And you look at the shadow on the wall, but don't turn around.
Yeah.
Okay. So we're not going to turn around, and we are going to acquiesce to you as a leader. If we are going to fall in line and we're going to follow you, isn't it your responsibility to have an accurate description of that fire?
Right.
That's the fiscal policy part. You are forcing poor countries to make decisions now. So Argentina right now, for example, is another example, right? They have shifted course completely in what they have done. He's lowered interest rates, we talk about 7%, 6%. He's lowered interest rates to 60%.
What? Lowered them?
Lowered them to 60%. In Egypt right now, if I want to get a loan to the bank, my interest rate's hovering between 25 and 30%. And we're crying about 7,
Yeah.
right? So my point is that he's forced to do it. He is forced to work with the IMF. And I remember this conversation, my mother telling this conversation when we first started the company and what she had to go through. President Millet did something very similar to the IMF and said, we've defaulted on you 9 times or 10 times, whatever it is. We'll default again, or we can pay you. But if we're going to pay you, you're going to restructure this debt for us right now.
Right.
And they did.
Yeah.
So he understood economics. He has a
Yeah.
PhD in economics. He understood economics, right? But what he's dealing with is strict, harsh austerity measures in Argentina that are leading to protests.
I was going to say, is there buy-in?
Of course,
See, this is
no.
the thing, and like most people don't understand this. Like they don't understand basic economics. It just goes
No,
right over their head. I mean, even we don't in the United States. Like we don't understand what
there are
the
times that I don't. There are times
yeah,
when our policymakers don't. Those people are protesting austerity measures because it makes their life unbearable. It
sure.
makes their quality of life unbearable. And I don't blame them. But what choice do you have? What choice when you force a country like Argentina, who is it's a unionized country, you're forcing a country like Argentina to actually make decisions that haven't worked for 70 years, but now you're forcing them to make these decisions. Otherwise, they just keep kicking the can down the road. We'll default because we'll get money again. We'll just keep defaulting. we'll get money again. We'll just keep defaulting. And there were no repercussions. We're
Mhm.
going to cut off your credit line. We're going to do this. And then nothing happens. Why? Because some of the biggest banks in the US have loaned them, have loaned them money as well. I ask everybody, I spent some time researching this. When I was in university and I was studying the finance aspect, a big part of our international economics program was studying the debt crisis of the 80s with Latin America.
Mm.
And all the major banks that almost went under. Imagine, forget about Lehman Brothers going under in 08. Imagine if Citi, Lehman, JP, Wells Fargo, Bank of America. Imagine if every one of them went belly up within a month of each other. That's what was at stake
Mhm.
in the 80s. That's what was going to happen if we didn't step in. It seems like the policymakers today forgot to read that whole case study.
Yeah.
Right. There's obviously a ton of investment happening in buying, but you're seeing now banking companies like HSBC yanking out investment, taking their loss and saying, we're out of Argentina. We're taking the loss and we're getting out. We're taking the loss, right? It's a hefty loss.
Mhm.
And we're getting out. Right. All it takes is a bunch of other countries to default on their loans with HSBC for the bank to be in trouble.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, it's $1 trillion bank. But these are, remember, these are decisions that the country is being forced to make. I'm not saying kicking the can down the road was the right idea either, right? It didn't work for 70 years. I'm not saying that was the answer either. But my point here is that if you're going to let Argentina default 9 times or 10 times, why didn't Sri Lanka get that same luxury? Why?
And why? Do you know? Do you know why?
They just said, we're not going to pay you. But then because of all so many banks in the US and Canada and worldwide had money invested in Argentina that they were lobbying, saying, no, we need to, who's the biggest financier of the IMF? The US. Right. So
Yeah.
you have the biggest banks in the world lobbying the US government, lobbying the IMF, saying, let them default. Please forgive the debt. Just forgive the debt. Forgive the debt. We cannot have the country declare bankruptcy.
Yeah.
In essence, they were declaring bankruptcy 9 times.
So what are the natural resources in Argentina that the world cares about
Lithium.
versus Sri Lanka? Sri Lanka have any exports or anything?
Tea, tons. I mean, agriculture, tea, there's mineral, rich in minerals there as well. But lithium is the biggest thing in Argentina. Sri Lanka's got other exports as well that are there. But, again, what we talked about last episode, last time. Lithium is their biggest export, but the only way to mine it is to actually basically manipulate the people there to ruin their quality of life. Right. So you're robbing Peter to pay Paul. In this case, it's not robbing Peter to pay Paul. You're robbing Peter to pay Paul. Then you're shooting Paul to pay Peter.
Yeah.
That's essentially it. And then you're shooting Peter to pay Robert. It's not tenable. It doesn't last.
Right.
It doesn't last. And these repercussions that are occurring. Argentina's inflation is up near 300%, over 300%. They devalue their currency at 800 pesos to a dollar. From the tourism standpoint, it has made tourism very expensive in Argentina because everything in tourism was based in dollars.
Yeah.
So you have to now convert everything from pesos to dollars at 800 pesos to a dollar, not 300. A lot of people think, oh, well, the peso's down 800. Argentina is going to be dirt cheap. It's the other way around.
Right.
It's the other way around.
Yeah.
And then you have countries like Costa Rica that do not understand what is happening. Tourism is their biggest export above anything else.
Yeah.
And they are a dollar-denominated currency versus their currency, which is a sucre. They devalued the dollar to prop up their currency to combat inflation. They didn't combat it, they just hit it.
Yeah.
It's going to get worse. They just shot themselves in both feet. It's going to get worse. It's the wrong decision. But they didn't know what choice did they have.
Yeah.
Right? They had a tourism inflow that came in when, again, another country that did get it right initially because they opened their borders early enough where tourism came in and they understood what their chief export was. Just like Galapagos did, Ecuador did. They understood their chief export. Yep. Right. It was tourism. And they did a great job in terms of how they handled it. The travel insurance, they made travel insurance mandatory. They took all the right steps. they also borrowed so much money. They've
Mm.
had runaway inflation like everybody else. And their product, their tourism, which is their biggest export, has become so commoditized
Yeah.
where everybody is basically fighting. And this is a separate episode. We're going to talk about this,
Yeah.
right? About the challenges facing Costa Rica. But they were forced into some of these decisions.
Mm.
They were forced into some of these decisions. Again, I am not talking about, well, should we have ignored the pandemic? I'm not.
Yeah.
But if you're promising the world that if you take these steps, the pandemic will go away and COVID will be gone, it's still here.
Yeah.
It's still here.
Yeah. And there was no playbook for this. So it's really
No,
interesting how the different countries handle things and what the outcome
the,
was,
the
you know.
the president of South Africa, the president of Tanzania, the president, Prime Minister Modi from India, the president of Ecuador, I'm trying to think who else, the president of Colombia at the time, all said the same thing. If we think that COVID is just going to go away, we're dreaming. President Rwanda said this too. If we think that it's going to go away, we're dreaming. We have dealt with diseases like this in the past. It doesn't go away, it becomes part of our society.
Yep.
They all said this in one form or another. Why weren't we listening?
Yeah.
Right? Countries that have other exports, not just tourism, no problem.
Because we were trying to just survive. Everyone was trying to survive.
Sure. But the
And
US
really
had
couldn't see past.
Sure, but the U.S. has so much in the way of export besides tourism. Europe has so
Yeah.
much in the way of export besides tourism. Asia has so much in the way of exports besides tourism. Right? I'm talking about China and India.
Yeah.
They had the luxury of making these. Australia and New Zealand had so much in the way of exports. Besides tourism. Yes, tourism was a big part of it, but they had so much in the way of it besides exports, besides tourism. These
So
other countries don't.
how does somebody like me
Hmm.
help make a difference in these countries that are truly suffering?
It's very simple. Pay a fair price for what you're doing.
Okay.
Pay a fair price for what you're doing. This is something that Argentina is dealing with. Costa Rica is really dealing with this right now, right? You have such a commoditized product. Everybody's looking for a deal. Everybody's looking for that. They're looking and Costa Rica to their disservice, right? To their disadvantage, they are allowing it.
Okay.
The product in Costa Rica, and this is going to lead to a separate episode completely, but Costa Rica, they're cannibalizing their product, right? They are literally, each of them is cutting it, not cut, what's the phrase? Cut off your nose
to spite your face.
They're cutting off each other's noses, not their own.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's commoditizing itself, which means they're allowing it. And I draw a parallel to a company like General Motors.
Okay.
General Motors hasn't been able to charge a full price for a car in probably 24 years, 25 years, maybe longer. They still can't charge a full price for a car because the discounts on their models, except for stuff like Corvettes and whatnot, the discounts on their models are here to stay. It's part of their business plan, right? It's part of their business plan. Costa Rica is at risk of that happening, where it becomes part of their business plan. So if you want to combat this, anybody who's listening, you want to help these countries out, pay a fair price. Yeah, it's gotten expensive. I understand it has gotten expensive. It has gotten crazy expensive, but travel was never supposed to be a right. It was supposed to be a privilege.
Yeah.
It was never supposed to be a right for everybody. It's not something that everybody can do. I'm not talking about elite because you have money. I'm talking about fully understanding the reason why you're going there and understanding the gift of being there. Somebody in Costa Rica, pay a fair price.
Yeah.
That's keys. Argentina, pay a fair price. East Africa, Southern Africa, pay a fair price. Is it expensive? Absolutely. But if we're having the conversation about going there, if you're having a conversation and you're making plans, I don't care who you work with, but you're making plans about going there, then you have to have a realistic idea of what things cost, right? If you take the cost of tourism in certain countries, and look, I'm taking Europe out of this because there's a separate scale happening there. But you take the poorest countries in the world, and you take their pricing from 2019 and just add 15% every year, you will end up roughly where they are right now.
Okay.
So if you want to get a discount and travel for less, that should have happened in 2021. Oh, wait, the borders weren't open yet because they weren't allowed to be open because they're publicly shamed.
Yeah.
But that's when you should have gone.
Mm-hmm.
If you still wanted somewhat of a lesser price, fine. 2022 would be a one as well. No, now, no. That COVID discount's gone. That window's closed. You can't go back and ask for it. And asking the people in those countries and making them feel guilty for what they're charging, or forcing them, because they will, if you push them, they will lower their prices. If you push them, they will come back and say, oh, okay. We want the volume. We'll reduce our costs to their detriment.
Yeah.
You as a traveler will get a great deal. The problem is the 10 people that come after you will also now get a deal that's underpaying for what they're doing. How does a country like Costa Rica, a country like Argentina, a country like Kenya, a country like Egypt, how do they now charge a fair price?
Yeah.
You're not talking about metal and plastic and leather and rubber and tires and a car being manufactured in a factory. You're talking about somebody's livelihood.
Mm-hmm.
You're talking about something that's living, breathing, that has emotion and feeling, and you're telling them that you visiting their country is more important than them putting food on the table.
Mm-hmm.
Haven't they been through enough?
I remember you saying this back, and we did a webinar back in, I think, early 2020. It was focused on
Inflation.
inflation, but I do clearly remember you advising, I think it was travel advisors that we
Mhm.
were talking to at that time, do not lower your prices, do
Right,
not discount.
right.
You will, how many years will it take you to dig
Ten,
back out of that?
5 years for every 10%.
Yeah.
Yeah, 5
So,
years for every 10% is what's going to take. In Costa Rica, I mean, you're talking about discounts upwards of 20%. They're laying off people in tourism in Costa Rica right now. Laying off people in tourism in Costa Rica because of what they did. They lowered their prices. Absolutely. I remember that webinar. I was
mhm.
begging people, do not
Yeah.
lower your prices. And I gave you, remember we talked about this example of Saks Fifth Avenue and Abercrombie and Fitch.
Yeah.
Saks Fifth Avenue lowered their prices after the '08 collapse to get volume. Abercrombie and Fitch kept their prices high and said, we will sell our clothes at a higher level because we want to retain the quality of these clothes. Even if it means we have a drop in sales, we want to protect the value of our product.
Yeah.
Saks has been sold 2 times, 3 times now since that conversation in 2008. Since that case, Abercrombie and Fitch is in a much better position.
Yeah.
Saks
That,
has been flirting with bankruptcy for the longest time. Abercrombie and Fitch has not.
and of course that brings to mind for me the companies where you know you don't even ask, like you know you're not going to get a deal on an Apple, anything from Apple,
No.
Disney, you're never going to get a discount. You might get
No.
some value add, but those are two brands I can think of right off the bat where the price is the price is the price is the price.
Right. And if you don't like it, don't come.
If you get, yes, as my kids would say, were said to my kids in preschool, you get what you get and you don't throw a fit.
That's right. That's right. You don't get
Yeah.
upset. That's right. Get what you
Yeah.
get. You don't get upset. That's exactly right.
Hmm.
Apple, anybody who's read Steve Jobs' biography, if it's look, if you know anything about Steve Jobs, talk to anybody who's worked at Apple, who worked with Steve Jobs, anybody will tell you he was a jerk
Mm.
as a person. But in terms of the way he approached things, and I'm an Android guy, and this is me
Mm.
talking about Apple.
Yeah.
That company was near bankruptcy when I was in university. I was just coming out of college when the first iPhone came out. When iBook first came out, I was in university. That company was in dire straits. I remember what it looked like. It was dire straits.
Hmm.
And the first thing Steve Jobs talked about was, we are going to create a product that people enjoy using.
Mm.
We are going to charge for our talent. Then he went and got the most skilled people. And this is the type of person he was. When the iPhone 4 came out, that's when they first put that metal band around the phone.
Yeah. I
With the
think I still
antenna.
have one in my house.
Well, the antenna was built into the band.
Yeah.
So apparently somebody messed up, and the antenna, when you'd hold the phone a certain way, it would drop the call because you're squeezing the antenna. After
Oh.
firing the engineers, he then came back and realized he was onto something. Now, again, there's a million different ways to look at this, but look at what he's charging. When the price of Android phones and iPhones went up to over $1,000, these guys are crazy and da 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 da. Last time I checked, they're still selling a boatload of them.
Yep.
I mean, think about the expedition ships that you were on.
Hmm.
The one that has the desalinator.
Yeah.
Those weren't cheap expeditions.
No, they weren't. And we did not discount either. We did
No.
not discount. The company failed for other reasons, but
Sure.
there were no discounts. There were early booking savings,
Right.
but there were no last minute deals.
Right.
So, and I'm sure a lot of that was there was cash flow concepts
Sure.
around surrounding that and so forth.
Sure.
But
It's not easy. If it
when
was,
you're with a small group of people and they're price comparing, you can't do that. It's not
no.
sustainable.
No, and you
Yeah.
have to, you have to have the power to say no. Look, and
Mhm.
that's a lot of these countries are raising their prices and saying, look, this is what it is. If you don't want to come, don't come.
Mhm.
They're hoping you still understand the value, and for the most part, they do, right?
Yeah.
But it's one where they're sticking to who they are. They're staying true to who they are. That means something.
Yeah.
And that's something that has to be taken into account. And that's what I mean when you talk about everybody should think this concept, right? Countries like Kenya, the services sector makes up 60% of Kenya's economy. Tourism is a large part of it, yeah, obviously, as well. But this is the theory that I have floated now for 15 years because I have the math to back it up, right? From people smarter than me that have shown me the math, and I did the math myself, and it actually works. If you take any country, and you've heard me say this as well, if tourism, and I mean specifically sustainable tourism, responsible, socially responsible tourism, not overcrowding, not over tourism, but socially responsible tourism.
Mhm.
If that is in place, and that concept of tourism makes up 10% of a country's GDP, there are direct correlations to political and economic stability, and it gets proven over and over and over again. Ecuador, the Minister of Tourism for Ecuador is one of the most dynamic people you'll ever meet. The current Minister of Tourism, one of the most dynamic people, engaged in every which way. The ministers of tourism from Peru, you all know how I feel about them. They could learn from what these guys are doing. The ministers of tourism for Colombia are engaged, right? But you notice whenever there was protests or something happening, they would rally together and put out statements and do different things and be able to explain why something is happening. Right. And I'll draw a reason why this is so important, right? From a fiscal standpoint of a country. They have understood, first of all, their biggest export. And that's the biggest problem during the pandemic. Calculating the aggregate contribution that tourism made to the world's economy was never done. The World Travel Tourism Council says by the end of the decade, well, right now, 1 in 10 jobs, by the end of the decade, 1 in 6 jobs will be tourism related.
Wow.
Right? Right now, 1 in 10. But that's an aggregate. There's no centralized formula or centralized indicator. You have an indicator for new housing starts. You have an indicator for retail sales, an indicator for unemployment, an indicator for GDP, an indicator for non-durable goods, for non-farm payroll, for everything else. You don't have an indicator for tourism. And you can't, because tourism is the one bucket that is applied to every single thing. If you are a hotel, your indicators fall into new commercial construction. If you are a touring company, a DMC, or a tour operator, you're buying vehicles, you fall into auto sales. If you are a restaurant and you're buying curtains and you're buying furniture, you're falling into retail sales, non-durable goods.
Right.
It's a whole. There's no bucket. There's no calculate. There's no way to calculate. And look, I work with an economics firm very closely that helps us with our indicators, and I've asked them as well. There is no actual indicator in terms of how things are happening, and that hasn't changed during the pandemic. That hadn't changed. So that was basically where this came in, right? So you think about this. You think about the fact that you've got countries that have understood this.
Yeah.
The poorest countries understood where their bread was being buttered, whereas the world economy didn't understand just how much butter the tourism industry was providing for their bread.
Are there any, I'm not thinking specifically of tour companies, and I know we need to wrap it up, but not thinking specifically about maybe travel companies, are there any corporations, like big global corporations, that you could point to and say they are furthering the cause of trying to, promote tourism, promote world economies? I mean, that might be a loaded question, but I just wonder if there's anybody that
Yeah, the World
stands
Travel
out
Tourism
as
Council, the World Travel
okay.
Tourism Council, and I'm
Yeah.
a proud regional member of the World Travel Tourism Council.
Okay.
And they absolutely further this cause. They're the ones who came up with that safe travel certification during the pandemic.
Oh, I remember that.
They're
Yeah.
the ones who came up with that.
Yeah.
They're the ones who put out papers. They're the ones who put the stats together that understand economic impact. They're the ones who actually furthered this initial message. They held their last conference in Rwanda for a reason. They could have held it anywhere in Europe, but they held it in Rwanda.
We need to have we need to have them on, one of your fellow members on.
We can definitely try.
Talk about that.
I think I've got a couple of ideas. I can definitely
Yeah.
ask. And they are, look, is it controversial? Some of the stuff they say, absolutely. Like right now, they're talking about Saudi Arabia, and they are making a push, and it's controversial with Saudi Arabia. But if you
Mhm.
listen to the reasoning, and look, I told you, I'm the son of a Sudanese
Mhm.
refugee. If you listen to the reasoning why they're pushing Saudi Arabia, it actually makes sense
Pushing it as a destination to
as a
visit?
destination for tourism.
Okay.
Yeah, and then people will say, well, I don't like the rights on homosexuality and LGBTQ and whatnot. I understand. I understand. But then you shouldn't go to Egypt either, or Uganda,
Mm-hmm.
or about 10 other countries in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's not, it's a, you have, if a country is showing you a new face, you have to be willing to see that face. We're willing to forgive Rwanda and see a new face when they committed genocide of over 1 million people. But we're willing to forgive that. I'm not saying to forgive Saudi Arabia. I'm not talking about that, but understand the economic impact. Saudi Arabia has figured out that oil revenues are declining.
Mm.
I'll wrap this up with this statement from a fiscal standpoint, because we've talked about a lot here,
Yeah.
right? And there's a lot to unpack here. We can make several episodes on each
Yeah.
topic, but just think about this with Saudi Arabia. Sudan as a country imploded and broke into two countries, South Sudan and Sudan, through a civil war. There's another civil war happening right now in Sudan. We've talked about this with my uncle thing from Sudan during this. I've had a front row seat to this.
Mm-hmm.
And it's being encompassed within the African continent, meaning that it's isolated. You really think that's going to happen if Saudi Arabia implodes? Do you really think that's going to happen if that economy fails? And I know they have a ton of money and whatnot. Do you have any idea how much they subsidize for their citizens, from fuel prices to cost of living? They pay so much to their citizens, and they have to keep peace with the royal family, among other things. And you have a country that has obligations, from defense contracts to everything else, plus obligations for oil, plus everything else. And they're seeing declining oil revenues because of the fact that OPEC as a concept is starting to really fade away.
Mm.
Right? And people can disagree with me, but the facts are there. Right? Look at gas prices right now. And if every country in OPEC still increased their production, you still would not see that much of a blip because of price gouging and other measures. Look at how many electric cars are being sold right now from everybody, and how many companies are getting in with this mark of 2035 to be fully electric, or net zero by 2050. They're seeing the writing on the wall. So if somebody doesn't like the Saudi government, well, you shouldn't say the Dorchester either, because they own them.
Yeah.
So, I mean, just think about this for a second.
Mm-hmm.
You have to play things 5 steps forward. Disagree with me? No problem. I understand. Disagree with me? No problem. But just think about it. I'm not asking you to agree with me. I'm just asking you to think about what I'm saying. That's where I want to leave it. The fact that you have to understand that these countries are going through these changes. But the 3 things that I want to take away from here, for anybody, for all of our listeners: 1, pay a fair price for your trips. That's the first way you get to help. 2, and not only by the way, that's one of the biggest resistances to over tourism is about paying a fair price. And that means a higher price, because you're actually then inviting people from different parts of the country that aren't part of the tourism mechanism to that same equation, to open up other parts of the country, to get you away from the masses. So pay a fair price for what you're doing, whatever that price is. 2, have an open mind. Understand fully. And 3, and this is the thing I leave at the doorstep of our world leaders, whoever they are, because they went into hiding during the pandemic. So whoever they are, the world leaders, Figure out how you can calculate accurately the aggregate demand of tourism, the aggregate contribution, excuse me, of tourism in your economy. I won't say our economy, because if you actually understood it as our economy, this would have been done a long time ago. The data's there. All you have to do is sit down and do it. So I'm throwing down those three things. And to anybody who was in the WHO and in World Bank, I am not coming after you personally, but I am holding you responsible.
All right.
How's that?
Are you blue in the face?
I'm blue in the face. Are you green? Do you see green yet?
I see green.
I told you I can go on for hours. I've got ideas for 4 more episodes now.
Yeah. No, it's good. It's good.
Did this? Is your head spinning yet, or
Yeah, it is. It's a lot to absorb. And yes, my head's spinning, and yes, it makes me think about even local. I mean, to get really granular and just think about local things as well. But I do think, just the pay a fair price. I mean, don't try to go for the deal. Go for, the real deal. The real deal being, your experience and what you're doing to
you
prop
want
up
to
an
go for a
economy and all
deal
that.
for a commodity, something like a piece of steel or a car, or be my guest.
Yeah.
But when you're dealing with human capital, no,
Yeah.
no, that's a different thing altogether.
Yeah. All right. Well, I got a lot to think about.
I agree. Well, I'm glad. So till
Yeah.
next time.
Yep. This was fun. Thanks, Ashish.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks everybody for listening. Till next time, you'll catch Leigh and I on our next episode. What are we going to be talking about next episode?
Tourism in a post-Mandela world.
All right, we're going to South Africa. It's going to be
South Africa.
interesting. Yep. And you know what? It actually, the tea leaves lead us there quite organically. So we're going to be able to, I love it. It's going to fit in, because that's a complicated conversation about the African National Congress.
Yeah. I'm going to do a little research before. I'm going to educate myself a little bit before we get to that, so I can at least have something to contribute.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
All right.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Ashish.
My pleasure. Take care.